Rage is yet another game I've long meant to play. As a fan of a majority of id Software's output, it somehow slipped through the cracks through the years as I heard middling things. I eventually played Rage 2, a game I had conflicted feelings on, which, as a result, never had me curious to see the origins of this peculiar duology. But after playing through Quake 2 and the id Software RPGs, I had been feeling a certain itch that apparently only id Software could scratch. I played a bit of Doom 3, and finally decided to dive headfirst into my biggest id blind spot with Rage. And I'm glad I waited, honestly. Not only does Rage hold up incredibly well, but playing it removed from the landscape it released in, it's a stronger experience than many of its contemporaries. Rage is masterfully crafted in a handful of ways, and those ways never cease to be impressive in the year 2023. First and foremost is the game's visual accomplishment. Now, you might take a look at this game and think, Jordan, thou hypocrite, you make fun of so many other games for being gray-brown shooters that don't vary their color palettes at all. And yeah, I stand by that, but Rage is a textbook definition of the exception that proves the rule, because unlike 99% of the other nearly monochrome action games from the era, Rage uses its color palette to enhance its art design. This is a gorgeous game throughout, from the photorealistic skyboxes to the deeply detailed craggy rock canyons and grimy industrial environments. Rage is literally dripping with atmosphere. Like, it literally drips on you, but I'll get to environmental variety in a minute. Rage's presentation is slick yet minimalist. There's no mini-map in the game's instant settlements, meaning you're left to learn the lay of the land on your own. It's reminiscent of immersive sim games like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines or Deus Ex in that way, and thanks to the distinctive architecture and environment design, it's never too hard to grab your bearings, though some instructions are unclear and can lead to walking around in circles when you enter a new town. Along with the minimalist exploration, the menu design and much of the interactions feel like a stripped-down, streamlined RPG. I particularly like the smooth menu transitions for the shop owners and various NPCs. In these menus, you can buy ammo and upgrades for your car and weapons, and sell scrap and items you've scavenged from the wasteland. However, despite the car travel and RPG elements like settlements and upgrades, Rage isn't really an open-world game to my surprise. You can roam the spaces between towns and find small collectibles, but these highways mainly serve as turbo-powered corridors to take you between levels. In all these ways, Rage subverts expectations. I'd expected to find a pseudo-open-world game like Borderlands or just straight-up a Far Cry-esque joyride, but no, there's not even a world map to access, and even the racing side activities, which are ever-present staples of open-world games, can only be accessed from the settlements. Makes for an odd experience to revisit in 2023, where you do get a feeling of exploration and vastness, but without the endless slog of side activities and fluff that infest games like Rage 2. The problem here is that this minimal open world is used for a lot of padding. The first half of the game is basically a bunch of back and forth fetch quests where you're not actually playing the game properly and raiding mutant hideouts. There's a lot of go here, talk to this person, which becomes a series of long-winded conversation that usually leads to something I'm pretty ambivalent about, like the game's racing side quests, and gets in the way of the things I'm here for, shooting dudes in the face. The characters are at least somewhat different aesthetically, and thanks to what appear to be non-motion captured rigging, the animations have a lively, exaggerated, almost cartoonish quality that may be somewhat at odds with the gritty setting, but brings the cast to life in a lovingly handcrafted way you don't see in our modern era of everything being motion captured. Speaking of animation, special attention should be called to the enemy and AI animations. As enemies take cover, crawl around the environment, jump over obstacles, and more, there's a massive amount of unique, authored animations they use, and it all looks fantastic. In the heat of firefights, the variety and personality shown here goes a long way towards bringing this otherwise dead wasteland to life. The biggest problem with Rage is the drip-fed story, which basically sees you playing errand boy between a few scavenging factions for several hours, proving yourself as a Mad Max stand-in and taking out various pockets of crazed mutants or bandits. Narrative has never been id Software's strong suit, and Rage is no exception. You play a nameless ARC survivor and navigate a series of mostly upstanding citizens, running constant favors while only hearing things about the more villainous factions of the wasteland. There's a lot of effort that's gone into the world building of Rage, with the ARC and the high-tech authority setting it apart from bog-standard Mad Max fare, but few of the characters really stand out as memorable, despite the fact that most have bespoke names as you roam the settlements. The narrative is lacking in oomph, and feels like it ends with a whimper just as it begins to escalate. There are a few neat boss battles throughout the game, but the last mission is just one long hallway and then credits, which is disappointing. I do recommend playing the DLC, however, which helps to pad the runtime with a side story about a group of pyromaniac bandits called the Scorchers. It's mostly just more gameplay, but it ends with a more bombastic boss battle against an airship, and the additional environments are gorgeous. Despite the wasted potential for a sprawling apocalyptic tale, the team does make good use of the setting for the locales and the unique enemies that often infest them. There are a variety of factions in Rage, and most missions see you facing down one or two of them unique to their respective locations. These factions also play into Rage's gameplay variety, as different groups have different approaches to combat. For example, the Authority are bullet sponges with high-tech help like sentry guns and laser gates, but your average wasteland mutant will simply swarm you en masse and force you to switch up your tactics. You visit underground bunkers, hillside hotels overrun by cannibals, abandoned subway stations, ramshackle settlements suspended over canyon cliffs, and even abandoned skyscrapers in mutant-overrun cities. While each biome has its own challenges and enemies, and unique color schemes to help differentiate the atmosphere, the goals are almost universal. You gotta get a thing, and people are in your way. These levels are where Rage really sings. There isn't a whole lot of diversity between the levels you play, at least in terms of gameplay. There are a few turret sequences, but it's mostly just shooting your way down various corridors and courtyards. Thankfully, id Software brought the goods when it comes to said shooting, and Rage has plenty of fun to mix up the action. You've got a basic assortment of weapons like your rocket launcher, shotgun, assault rifle, and a few flavors. But then you've got a few unique assets in the mix like a stealthy crossbow, buildable turrets, and even a little spider bot that will follow you and murder anything that doesn't like how you're dressed. Even though I know it's really just the Doom 3 spotter bot. I love the little guy. The shooting is punchy, with good feedback and sound effects, and of course there's plenty of good id Software giving to go around. Headshots pop appropriately, but more than that, the way enemies vaporize near grenades may be one of my favorite things this side of liquidating enemies with a shotgun in the first Fear game. But what really gives Rage its amazing gameplay variety is the ammo system. Every weapon has multiple kinds of ammo, some can be bought and others can be made using improvised materials. The range from standard things like a grenade launcher stand-in for the shotgun to outlandish, creative gear like mind control arrows that allow you to turn enemies into suicide grunts around their allies. Just when you run out of your favorite ammo, or you don't think you have what it takes to take down a tough baddie, you remember you have special rounds for your sniper rifle or even your pistol to get the job done. In essence, the multiple ammo types stand in for full weaponry with their own drawbacks, meaning that Rage's weapon selection can be considered multiple times what you see in your inventory. However, the act of weapon selection itself never gelled for me. In another attempt of Rage refining FPS staples, you hold down a button while one stick maneuvers weapons and the other your selected ammo type. It feels like a alpha version of Doom 2016. No slow-mo weapon wheel yet, but 4 equipable weapons and selectable ammo types on the fly. It's a bummer they hadn't thought of slow motion during the menu yet, because it feels like it would make it 100% better instead of frantically switching through weapons in the heat of a firefight where both of your sticks are taken up and you just stand still while people shoot at you. And drawbacks like this hold Rage back from being an unimpeachable classic. Some finicky menu design, a lackluster story, a padded campaign. But none of that means you shouldn't play Rage or even replay it. Rage's emphasis on gunplay and stripped-down resource management makes for a lean, mean take on games you may be more familiar with, like Mad Max or Rage 2. The atmosphere and art design is godlike, showing id Software at the absolute top of their game, and the variety in the gunplay and encounter design feels like an appropriate stepping stone to the studio's accomplishments in the rebooted Doom games. Even taken with its flaws, Rage is one hell of a good game, and a unique one at that, standing apart from most other shooters of its day, which makes it even more fascinating to revisit. The great thing about this era in gaming, and one of the reasons I started a series on shooters from it in particular, is how diverse the gaming landscape was. Not every shooter was a live service loot game, a hero shooter, or a battle royale. Sure, there were a ton of gray-brown, dude-bro military shooters, but as I've shown in previous episodes, there have been plenty of divergences from that formula, like Earth Defense Force 2017. The game that started a cult classic legacy, it's not entirely wrong to compare EDF 2017 to something like Sharknado. A knowingly cheap, cheesy, but earnest good time that has the goods where it counts, provided you can overlook almost everything else. EDF 2017 is the first game to make it to North America from the Simple series, a sub-brand of budget development Japanese games that date back to the PlayStation 2, and included other Xbox 360 cult classics like Onechanbara Bikini Samurai Squad. Like its zombie-slashing cousin, EDF 2017 is a very slight game, meaning there's not much to it. But much like Onechanbara, the core of the gameplay is solid enough to keep ardent fans invested for dozens of hours. There are no real cutscenes, just 50+ missions where you fight giant bugs, robots, and dollar store ultra kaiju while shooting down giant spaceships. If that doesn't appeal to you, then get out of here, because that's all there is. The story is primarily delivered via voiceover from a nebulous command center that keeps you informed of how the rest of the world is faring against this alien invasion. There's actually something to this approach, and the cheesy voiceover goes a long way towards concentrated world building. There's no real lore for the alien invaders, or where they come from, or any political power structures in the military. But the sole focus on humanity's desperate struggle makes for clear stakes and occasionally some surprisingly effective all-or-nothing battles. As you've noticed probably, EDF 2017 isn't much to look at on a good day. The game reuses a lot of assets from the Japan-only PlayStation 2 predecessor, and while there's a lot of bright colors and explosions, the game features a muddled color palette, sometimes thanks to a variety of inclement weather and various environment settings. The original release was apparently plagued by slowdown during intense encounters, and I'm not surprised when looking at the sheer scale this game works at. And then you throw in buildings that collapse under a slight breeze, and a cartoonish amount of explosions that Michael Bay would call over the top. But like I said in the beginning, this game might look cheap and crappy, but it has heart. Or at least it has scale. In EDF's case, it's not the motion of the ocean, it's the size of the ship. While many of the environments are reused and mixed up throughout the loosely duct-taped together campaign, almost every level in EDF 2017 features large-scale destruction against massive hordes of big baddies. While with the exception of the underground levels where you're left to navigate the massive hives of bugs, which are the clear lowlights of an otherwise adrenaline-pumping mindless romp. And this semi-open world scale is what makes EDF stand apart and work within its own premise. The camera is pulled back to not only give you a good view of the sprawling battlefield, but also make your character look and feel diminutive next to even the easiest giant bug prey. The aforementioned destruction adds nice pop and background action to the scenes like regular shooters might use sparks and smoke. And if you always have a missile or rocket launcher in your loadout, the end of most missions, at least in the variety of cityscapes, will see you standing in a leveled apocalypse where most buildings in your vicinity have been razed. Not only do these sights help give basic stakes and a feeling of surviving harsh battle, but it's an awesome way to reflect player action. It's a simple novelty, yet always fun. The semi-open worlds themselves are interesting to explore even if they fall apart around you. These aren't just bland Steam asset flip open worlds, but genuinely atmospheric recreations of Japanese city centers that feature detailed buildings, city parks, restaurants, subways, and more. The detail itself reminds me of the loving recreations of buildings you see in kaiju and tokusatsu films, where much of the passion and energy that goes into the buildings is meant only to look good in destruction. There's probably something profound to be extrapolated here, but I'm too busy blowing up giant ants to see it right now. But the destruction is only part of what makes EDF 2017's scale so fun. The other half is the massive mutants and robots you face. When the campaign starts, you'll face some ants and spiders, but it's not long before you'll be facing down horizons filled with hopping spiders, UFOs that wobble like they put one too many back before hopping in the cockpit, rampaging kaiju, and spaghetti-armed robots making war utilizing the latest in Gumby technology. To aid you in your quest are an assortment of vehicles, but while your ever-strengthening super soldier can take a licking and keep ticking, the vehicles provided by the last defense of Earth have the moral conviction of someone who loses an internet argument and posts a soy jack, and by that I mean none at all. They're kind of glass cannons, able to massively turn the tide, but at the expense of poor controls and weak durability. Truly, the mech is the only one I found slightly useful, and mostly you're better off just hoofing it. Accordingly, as the game continues, you will be treated to a wide variety of weapons to help you thin the herds of increasingly powerful creatures. Weapons, like health upgrades, can be picked up from defeated enemies, which makes for a strange RPG-like upgrade system where you're always unlocking things and improving without the use of stat points. Unfortunately, many of the weapons are useless variations of other guns, but the wide variety itself means you'll be able to experiment with what works best for your approach. There are a lot of weapons too, from sentry turrets to slow-as-molasses targeting rockets that pack a near-nuclear punch. You've got assortments of shotguns, armor-piercing auto-sniper rifles, automatic rifles with hundreds of rounds and a wider spread than Angela White, nearly useless flamethrowers, experimental plasma casters, and plenty more. The other side of the massive variety is that the shooting is just kinda okay. You press a button and things die and blow up, and that's the best thing I can say about it. You'll undoubtedly end up packing the wrong weapon on some missions, but thanks to the mostly short mission times throughout, you'll be able to start over and experiment without too much guff. Additionally, if the missions are too hard, you can always grind health and ammo on other missions and difficulties to continue. Earth Defense Force 2017 would go on to become a slight cult classic, garnering an earnestly dedicated fanbase in the States, and it's not hard to see why. The game wears its heart on its sleeve. It's a purely gameplay-driven experience, dedicated to an over-the-top spectacle on a scale that puts its contemporaries to shame, even though it's surpassed in most other areas. It's repetitive, the shooting isn't great, the graphics are kind of undefendable, but in many ways, Earth Defense Force 2017 transcends its flaws, turning them into part of its charm like an endearing late-night movie. Sometimes it's okay to just blow up giant ants and robots, and that's why I love video games. A glaring hole in my gaming history that has been filled now thanks to a gracious donation from a fan So I want to start this review by saying thank you to Sergeant Crispy. I truly appreciate the help in acquiring this game I wouldn't have been able to justify getting for myself at the moment, and I'm happy to be presenting it to you all today. King Kong, the official movie of the game, is a fascinating game for so many reasons. It's a licensed movie tie-in that doesn't follow the film's story, instead retelling the events with the involvement of the actual cast and Peter Jackson himself. It's a tightly scripted, atmospheric game that predates Modern Warfare and BioShock by several years, before each of those games basically rewrote the book on things like scripted action sequences and atmospheric environments. It utilized an entirely eidetic UI years before things like Dead Space, and despite being based on a pulpy action movie from 2005, King Kong is equal parts horror game, kaiju brawler, and first-person shooter. See, at the time there were very few great licensed games. There had been GoldenEye, of course, a few fondly remembered NES games, and then the then-recent Escape from Butcher Bay, but usually those games came down to the work of talented developers with little studio involvement. King Kong was actually made with input from Peter Jackson, attested to by this making-of documentary that tells the story of Jackson playing Beyond Good and Evil and recruiting Michel Ancel, the game's director, to help make King Kong. It's a wonderful little documentary that I'll link down below, and is a rare look into the nitty-gritty of game design aspects like sound design, mood, story, and even how developers try to put players in the shoes of their characters. See, Jackson may have provided plenty of input, which was rare, but it was really the game's team that made the game special. They set out to make a game that told the same story in an entirely different form, so instead of the regular movie game formula that either truncates the story of a film or spins off into a prequel or expansion, King Kong aims for a similar experience that sheds what doesn't work about a film and replaces it with the benefits of an interactive medium. The story is one of the main areas where the age of King Kong is apparent. Most of the cast members are voiced by their movie counterparts, and while Jack Black does an admirable job, Adrian Brody and Naomi Watts sound like they're two Xannies deep in their recording sessions. The other rough edge is the game's facial and character animations. While the wildlife animations are wonderfully fluid for the most part, the hitchy human animations and the wide-eyed lifeless stares from the early Xbox 360 wax sculptures meant to be characters takes a bit off the shine of the rest of the experience, but I don't want to make it sound like King Kong looks bad. Far from it, this game still looks and feels amazing to play. And a lot of that has to do with immersion. The thing King Kong really has in spades, from the rich sound design to the grim environments that feel plucked right from the Weta Digital Effects workshop. While a lot of movie tie-ins suffer from needing to expand the scope of the world through speculation from the game team, King Kong feels in lockstep with the world depicted in the movie, down to the endlessly impressive god rays and immaculate dripping sound effects. Memorable moments from the film are remade admirably, and the Hollywood production-level sound design still rings out head and shoulders above many other AAA games from the era. King Kong, in keeping with the original, feels like exploring the world of a 1940s pulp adventure novel, from the bizarre monsters to the questionable interpretation of native inhabitants, to the death-defying scenes of peril, many of which are infinitely more impressive for how they predate games like Modern Warfare and Uncharted 2, which would revolutionize action set pieces and shooters years later. Kong mostly nails that feeling of being a lost, helpless explorer in an uncharted realm. At least, it does until you try to explore. King Kong is more like a roller coaster ride in some ways than a typical action-adventure game. You're basically walking down a series of impressive-looking corridors as you battle island residents, leveraging limited ammo and scavenged weapons to survive. Much of this roller coaster style design can be seen in how the game uses Kong when playing as Adrian Brody's character, where you feel the massive scale of the beast, but from just far enough away that you're never directly interacting with him. It's not too different from the various rides King Kong has been seen on throughout the years, including the famous one at Universal Studios. The same use of scale and roller coaster style design combined with set pieces like a river raft dodging giant V-Rexes help create a sense of fast-paced fun, mixing up gameplay just enough to stay fresh while the impressive visuals and set direction are always giving you something new to gawk at. An impressive feat given that most of the game is simply the same green, grungy island. You play as Man, which I'm assuming is what Adrian Brody's character has been renamed to based on the back of the case, where the game says, "Play as Man, play as Kong," which is now also my favorite gender dichotomy. Man is a fragile beast, and the game does an amazing job of making you constantly feel in peril. Part of this is the thin UI, part of it is the enemy designs and encounters, and part of it is how the theme park ride world of King Kong always gives the appearance of having a deeper ecosystem at work behind its gameplay. There's no UI to speak of, aside from the obscuring haze that can occur when taking damage. It's a little too severe for my taste, and it does limit your vision, which I find incredibly annoying. But the other elements of gameplay are handled dynamically. For example, when you check your ammo, your character yells out how many magazines he has left to whoever he's traveling with. is a fascinating touch that doesn't take you out of the game and still gives you all the information you'd get from a proper user interface. This sparse approach to interface makes for a more immersive experience as you stay focused on the world around you. On that note, my other main complaint is the overly tight field of view, which feels occasionally limiting in wider areas. Still, it's an understandable concession because of how this game wants to make you feel helpless as a human. Helplessness, which comes from a variety of creepy threats. The monsters inhabiting Skull Island range from oversized bugs to even bigger bugs, weird bat creatures, and particularly vicious dinosaurs. As you battle various mixes of enemies, you dynamically learn there's a hierarchy to the jungle. Some enemies will fight others or leave them alone. Enemies can be baited towards conflict with one another by throwing smaller live creatures impaled on spears, a predecessor to Far Cry's wildlife baiting system years later. There are a variety of alert or feeding states that allow you to sneak past certain encounters or maneuver to a more advantageous position, like catching an enemy in a flammable patch of grass and lighting them ablaze. Despite a T rating with its assortment of toothy monsters, the gloomy environments, and the pulpy tone, King Kong definitely earns an honorary title of being a horror survival game. The roster is simple and maybe a smidge repetitive, but these hidden systems that react to your choices, while not overly expansive, still give enough of an impression of genuine intelligence to the animal AI. The game's difficulty is also ruled by several randomized factors that react to how well you play. If you die too much in one space, for example, enemies will be reduced along with damage. If you manage to go unscathed for too long, enemies will be more numerous and do higher damage. It's an interesting and dynamic system that makes for a nicely replayable jaunt. Combat might be the thinnest of Kong's gameplay systems, but for once that's not necessarily a bad thing because of how the game gives you options. As you survive the island, you come across a variety of guns like shotguns, Thompson machine guns, pistols, and rifles. These weapons feature some great crunchy sound work and satisfying kickback, and put down dinos with relative ease, the trade-off being the lacking ammo. When you don't have guns, you're primarily left to scavenge spears or bones from corpses of ancient giants, which have the same functionality. Turns out poking a dinosaur to death with a stick isn't nearly as easy as Caveman made it look. These spears can nail some enemies to walls, can be thrown or stabbed and lit on fire to either light burnable patches or enemies. Fire, when used correctly, can be a wonderful tool, but Skull Island giveth and taketh, and inclement weather will put out flames, leaving you just a little more helpless than usual. And that's really all there is to the combat, but because you're always scavenging and looking for a new gun or spear while trying to maneuver groups of giant bugs and dinosaurs, rarely did I have time to think about how simple the combat was. If the campaign lasted longer and didn't mix up weapons as often, I would have grown bored, but King Kong is a great example of a game where, when all the parts work together, you don't find yourself thinking about the minor flaws of the piece. And then there's the Kong sections. Along with the stilted dialogue from Naomi Watts' Haunted Barbie doll, the Kong sections of the game are hands down the worst aged part of the experience. They're not necessarily bad, just simplistic, which is fine when the FPS sections can leverage so many other elements like the ecosystem and weapons for tension, but when you're the all-powerful king of the jungle, it just leads to boredom. Most of the sections see Kong chasing or transporting Anne to solve puzzles like she's his partner in a LEGO Star Wars game. As these basic puzzles are solved, the duo are assailed by island creatures who Kong deals with by mostly swinging his arms wildly like a used car lot wavy tube man until everything is dead. Like the gunplay, the sound design elevates the gameplay here with Kong's guttural sound system shaking roars, bone-crunching hits, and heavy punches doing most of the legwork, but seems as though Kong only pays attention to leg day because other than that, there's not much to see as Kong swishes and sways, knocking everything over as his character model haphazardly collides with those of his enemies. There are some great camera angles and fights that end with Kong giving his enemies fatalities, and these do sometimes approach the cinematic approach the team was clearly going for. But by and large, there's not a whole lot here worth writing home about, and the Kong sections exist to help pad and break up the game's FPS sections. The final New York sequence is particularly unsatisfying as the team is forced to turn Times Square into a series of similar hallways with wonky cameras due to technical limitations. One other minor complaint is the massive amount of frame rate drops the game can see in busier moments. While it was never a huge problem with the Kong sections, in the heavier encounters towards the end of the game you can face squads of dinos with multiple NPCs running and attacking, fire effects going off everywhere, and the regular particle effects from water, and the engine is just not up to the task. I'm sure if the game were properly ported or even made backwards compatible on Series X, this problem would be easily remedied. It never really affected my enjoyment or playability, but is worth noting. And on the subject, King Kong is maybe one of the games I've seen most deserving of a port that will likely never see one. Warner Brothers, not Universal, are the ones making Kong movies now, and the game was made and published by Ubisoft and tied to a 2005 license, so I'm sure licensing around it is a nightmare. But King Kong is a fascinating and wonderful experience even today, and shouldn't be forgotten. It has a few rough edges because of its age, but when in the swing of its gameplay, you easily lose yourself to the swashbuckling adventure and the horrifying atmosphere of Skull Island. So many elements, from the simple UI to the ecosystem to set pieces dynamically integrated into gameplay, were so far ahead of its time, and looking back, it feels like it didn't get the credit it deserved for that. This game is one of the best kaiju games out there, and despite its minor flaws, King Kong has rightfully earned its place as an underrated classic for shooters and action-adventure games. Hello everybody, and thank you very much for watching this next episode of my Ranking Shooter series. It's been a minute since I did one of these, and I know people have been hungry for more gaming content, so I wanted to let you all know that after the second part of the Matt Walsh video essay, which will be coming either late this week or early next week, I will be dedicating almost all of October to video game content, including new Dead Domains, an entirely new shooter series, and some spooky fun old video essays of mine and some new ones. So I hope that you look forward to that, and if you'd like to help support me on these endeavors, please check out giving a couple bucks either at any of the links down below or to my Patreon, where you can get looks at how these videos are made and as they're made before they come out. On the note of gaming, please keep in mind that I am also now streaming every week, multiple times a week, on twitch.tv/deaddomain, so if you'd like to come over there and give a couple biddies, hang out and chat, we've had a lot of really fun chill streams, even when we aren't criticizing things like hate churches and conservatives. All of that having been said, what did you think of these entries on the list? Are there any other games in the shooter series you want me to look at next? Or even if you have stories of playing these games growing up? Let me know down in the comments below. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.